Amsterdam, September 1943. A girl with blonde braids cycles slowly along the Prinsengracht Canal, her basket filled with fresh flowers and warm bread, the very image of Dutch innocence. She catches her wheel on a cobblestone, stumbles and cries out, "Meneer! Help!" SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner, a man who spent his morning signing deportation lists, stands to assist the frightened child. As he reaches for her handlebars, she reaches into the flowers. She doesn't pull out a map, she pulls a Walther PPK. She fires 2 rounds into his chest at point-blank range and is pedaling away before his coffee cup hits the ground. Her name is Annelies de Vries. She is 15 years old. Brenner was her 23rd kill, and his death just saved 800 Jewish children from the morning trains to Westerbork. By the end of the war, this girl on a bicycle would be responsible for the deaths of over 52 Nazi officers. But how does a child become a ghost that haunts the entire Gestapo? And what is the price of a soul when your weapon of choice is a bicycle? Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Annelies wasn't born a killer, she was born the daughter of a mechanic. She grew up in the Jordan district, inside her father's shop, de Vries Fietsen. By age 6, she could strip a bicycle frame to its bolts. Her father, Jan, taught her that a bicycle wasn't just transport, it was freedom. On May 10, 1940, that freedom vanished. Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands, and by October, Jan de Vries was arrested for hiding Jewish neighbors. Annelies, only 14, stood in the crowd at Walsdorpervlacht and watched as a firing squad executed her father. She didn't cry. Instead, she looked at the German officers and began to memorize their faces. In late 1940, she was approached by Peter Vogel, a recruiter for the resistance cell de Gusen, the beggars. They didn't need soldiers, they needed invisibles. The test: she was tasked with cycling through Nazi checkpoints with illegal newspapers hidden in her frame. The result: German guards, conditioned to see Dutch girls as harmless, waved her through with a smile. By 1941, the resistance realized Annelies's unique potential. Under the mentorship of former Army officer Henrik Backer, she moved from courier to assassin. She was issued a Walther PPK 7.65mm, a compact, reliable pistol that fit perfectly beneath a layer of tulips in her bicycle basket. She mastered 4 primary methods of execution: the basket shot, drawing and firing while asking for directions; the drive-by, utilizing the speed of a downhill bridge to fire and vanish; the staged accident, using a collision to get within inches of a high-value target; the checkpoint ambush, using her innocent status to plant explosives at German guard posts. Unlike the monsters she fought, Annelies operated under a strict code. While the Gestapo, led by the obsessive Sturmbannführer Otto Kemper, labeled her a terrorist, she saw herself as a surgeon cutting out a cancer. She famously refused orders to kidnap the children of Nazi officials, telling her commanders, "The moment we hurt children, we become the monster we are trying to kill." By 1944, Annelies was no longer a girl, she was de Fietser, the cyclist. She lived in the shadows of the canals, a 15-year-old girl who carried the weight of 52 deaths in her basket, waiting for the day she could finally stop pedaling. In the narrow, winding streets of Amsterdam's Jordan district, the air always smelled of 2 things: the brackish water of the Brouwersgracht Canal and the heavy scent of chain grease. This was the world of Annelies de Vries, a girl who had learned to balance on 2 wheels by the age of 6 and could true a bicycle rim by 10. Her home was de Vries Fietsen, a cluttered, warm shop where her father, Jan, transformed rusted scrap into the sleek Gazelle and Batavis frames that carried the city's heartbeat. Since 1936, when her mother had died in childbirth alongside a stillborn brother, Jan and Annelies had been a fortress of 2. He taught her that a bicycle was a masterpiece of geometry. She taught him that even in a city of stone, a girl could be as swift and silent as a ghost. The peace of their idyllic life began to fray in 1939. The Goldstein family, neighbors from 3 doors down, began visiting the shop not for repairs, but for whispers. Annelies watched as her father cleared space in the damp basement, moving stacks of rubber tires to hide something more precious: people. When the sky finally broke on May 10, 1940, it wasn't with rain, but with the terrifying scream of Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers. The radio hummed with frantic Dutch broadcasts until the surrender 5 days later. Suddenly, the streets were choked with Feldgrau uniforms and the rhythmic thud of jackboots. Jan's shop became a secret way station for the invisible people, POWs and Jewish refugees fleeing the tightening noose of the Reich. Annelies, only 14, was the perfect shield. To the German patrols, she was just a pigtailed girl in wooden clogs running errands, her basket filled with harmless groceries that hid the maps and messages of a budding rebellion. The end of her childhood arrived on a gray morning in October 1940. A neighbor, seduced by the bounty of a collaborator's payout, pointed a finger. The Gestapo raid was swift and violent. Annelies stood frozen as soldiers dragged the Goldsteins from the cellar and hauled her father toward a waiting truck. 2 days later, during a final rain-slicked visit behind bars, Jan leaned close, his voice a rasping prayer. Be smart, be invisible, survive. On October 15, 1940, she was forced to stand among 200 others at the Walsdorper Vlak dunes. She watched through a veil of wind-blown sand as her father faced the firing squad. He didn't wear a blindfold. His eyes found hers in the crowd, not with a plea for help, but with a silent command of pride. When the volley of shots rang out, Annelies didn't scream or collapse. Something inside her, as delicate as a clockwork gear, snapped and was replaced by a cold, hardened steel. She returned to an empty shop that night, the silence of the Jordan weighing heavier than the Nazi occupation. As she sat at her father's workbench, clutching a rusted wrench, a shadow detached itself from the doorway. It was Peter Vogel, a man her father had trusted. He didn't offer comfort, he offered a purpose. Your father died fighting, Annelies, he whispered, his eyes reflecting the dim moonlight. Would you like to continue his work? Because the Nazis have a weakness they haven't realized yet. They don't look at children, and they never suspect a girl on a bicycle. Annelies looked at the empty street where her father should have been, then back at Peter, unaware that the choice she was about to make would soon lead her to a dark warehouse where the first lesson wouldn't be about mechanics, but about how to squeeze a trigger without blinking. Peter Vogel didn't start by giving Annelies a weapon. He gave her a secret. To join the Gusen, the ragtag resistance cell named after the 16th century beggars, who fought Spanish rule, she first had to prove she could hold a tongue as steady as a handlebar. Her test was simple. Memorize a list of 3 addresses and cycle past the Wehrmacht guard post at the Muntplein to deliver a verbal code. As she approached the steel-helmeted soldiers, her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. The guards barely looked up from their cigarettes. To them, she was just another local girl, insignificant and harmless. She was a ghost in broad daylight. This invisibility became her primary currency. Under the guidance of Commander Henrik Backer, a former army officer with eyes like flint, Annelies was taught the art of Gusen tradecraft. She learned to spot a Gestapo tail in the reflection of a bakery window and how to leave coded messages in the hollow of a loose brick along the Prinsengracht. Backer pushed her physically, forcing her to cycle for hours until her legs burned, mapping every shortcut, narrow alleyway, and steep canal bridge that a German staff car could never navigate. She lived in a world of strict compartmentalization. She knew only her cell, a precaution that ensured she could never betray more than she knew if the torture rooms at the Uterpestrit ever beckoned. The transition from courier to combatant was forged in the blood of the spring of 1941. After witnessing the public execution of 3 resistance members, Backer led her to a damp, lightless warehouse. He placed a Walther PPK 7.65mm into her hands. It was compact, sleek, and terrifyingly cold. A courier is a target, Backer told her as she practiced stripping the firearm in the dark. An armed courier is a soldier. You aren't murdering, Annelies. You are executing the enemies of our people. She proved a natural, her hands remaining unervingly still as she practiced drawing the pistol from a false bottom she'd built into her bicycle basket. She learned to shoot from the saddle, using the momentum of the bike to vanish before the shell casings even hit the cobblestones. In July 1941, the theory of war became a gruesome reality. While delivering a pouch of forged ration cards, she was spotted by Hendrik Mulder, a local collaborator who had once been a frequent guest in her father's shop. He recognized the bicycle, the unique gazelle frame Jan had built for her. Mulder cornered her in a dead-end alley near the docks, a cruel smirk on his face as he reached for her arm, smelling of cheap gin and betrayal. The Gestapo will pay well for the shop girl, he hissed. Instinct, sharpened by months of rage, took over. Annelies reached into her flower basket, her fingers finding the checked grip of the Walther. She fired 3 times into his chest. The reports were deafening in the narrow space, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating Mulder's shocked expression as he slumped against the brickwork. She pedaled away in a feverish daze, her stomach turning as she reached a safe house, where she collapsed into a fit of violent shivering. Peter Vogel found her there, her hands still stained with the gray soot of gunpowder. He didn't offer a hug, he simply took the gun and cleaned it. That night, she wept until her throat was raw, but when the sun rose over the Amstel the next morning, the tears had dried into a mask of stone. She realized then that Mulder was only the first on a list that was growing longer by the hour, and she was no longer just a girl, she was the most dangerous thing in Amsterdam. But as the Gestapo began to notice a pattern of dead collaborators found in the wake of a lone cyclist, they didn't just increase patrols. They brought in a man who specialized in hunting shadows, and his first trap was already being set. Henrik Backer didn't see a grieving teenager when he looked at Annelies. He saw a scalpel. After the death of Hendrik Mulder, the commander realized that her youth was not a liability to be protected, but a camouflage to be exploited. He sat her down in the dim light of the safe house and asked if she could do it again, if she could kill until the occupation broke. Annelies didn't hesitate. "They killed my father," she said, her voice devoid of the tremors that usually haunt 15-year-olds. "I'll kill 100 of them." With that vow, her education shifted from evasion to elimination. She spent hours in the warehouse learning the silhouettes of the German High Command, memorizing the silver piping on an SS Obersturmführer's collar and the specific gait of the Grünpolizei. She was taught close-quarters combat and how to slip a blade between ribs with the same mechanical precision she used to fix a puncture. By the spring of 1942, Annelies had perfected the basket shot. She would cycle toward a target, her Walther PPK hidden beneath a layer of fresh zinnias and a loaf of brown bread. She would stumble, look up with wide, tearful eyes and ask for directions. The moment the officer leaned in, the pistol would clear the flowers, barking twice at point-blank range. Before the body settled on the cobblestones, she was already 3 streets away. When the targets were more isolated, she used the drive-by, a feat of terrifying athleticism where she fired while in motion, managing the recoil of the 7.65mm rounds while maintaining her balance on the narrow bridges of the Amstel. The year became a blur of clinical executions. In March 1942, it was Wilhelm Krebs, a supply officer who had diverted local grain to the Reich. In April, she struck an NSB recruiter on the Magierbrug, the skinny bridge, disappearing into the mist before his guards could unholster their Lugers. By May, she had targeted Maria Visser, a Dutch collaborator whose whispers to the Gestapo had sent a dozen families to the transit camps. For Visser, Annelies staged an accident, tumbling her bicycle into the woman's path and finishing her in the confusion. Every mission was a success. Every escape was clean. But as the tally in her coded diary climbed, the girl named Annelies began to fade, replaced by the cold, efficient persona of De Fietser, the cyclist. Killing had become mechanical, a series of levers pulled and gears turned. She slept in 4-hour bursts, her ears tuned to the sound of distant truck engines, her mind replaying the faces of the fallen in a relentless loop. She was a weapon that happened to look like a schoolgirl, and the isolation was becoming a secondary prison. She could no longer trust the warmth of a neighbor's smile or the safety of a crowded street. To the resistance, she was a miracle. To the occupied Dutch, De Fietser was an urban legend, a symbol that the Nazis weren't as untouchable as they seemed. The Gestapo was left chasing shadows, frustrated by a killer who left no fingerprints and no witnesses, only the faint clicking of a bicycle chain in the dark. Yet, as her reputation grew, it caught the attention of a man who didn't believe in ghosts. SS Sturmbannführer Otto Kemper had begun to notice a recurring detail in every high-profile assassination file: the presence of a lone girl on a bicycle. He wasn't looking for a soldier anymore. He was looking for a child, and he was about to realize that her greatest strength, her innocence, was also the one thing that could lead him straight to her father's old shop. By September 1943, the occupation of Amsterdam had moved from a state of fear to a state of systemic erasure. SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner, the 32-year-old chief of Amsterdam Jewish affairs, was the primary architect of this silence. Intelligence from a resistance mole inside the German administration confirmed the unthinkable. 800 children held at the Holland Schouwburg creche were scheduled for deportation on September 29. Their destination was the gas chambers of Poland. The resistance high command issued a singular order: Brenner had to die before the trains left. For 2 weeks, 15-year-old Annelies de Vries shadowed him, identifying a lethal pattern of habit. Every afternoon at 2 p.m., Brenner took a solitary coffee at Café Hoppa on the Prinsengracht, his guards lingering out of earshot while he reviewed the deportation lists that doomed entire generations. On the morning of September 27th, Annelies prepared for what would become her most legendary strike. She checked her Walther PPK, chambering a 7.65 millimeters round with the practiced hands of a mechanic. She looked the part of a perfect Dutch schoolgirl, blonde braids, a clean dress and wooden clogs, while her bicycle basket was a calculated deception of fresh zinnias, a loaf of bread and schoolbooks. By 2 p.m. she was cycling slowly down the Prinsengracht, her eyes fixed on the man at the corner table. Brenner was engrossed in his papers, a man so convinced of his own invincibility that he barely looked up when a girl's bicycle wheel caught on the treacherous cobblestones. Annelies staged the stumble with cinematic precision, calling out in a frantic Dutch plea, "Meneer, help please." It was Brenner's final mistake. He was conditioned to see children as harmless. As the officer stood and reached for her handlebars to assist, Annelies's calculating gaze met his patronizing one for a fraction of a second. In one fluid motion, her right hand plunged into the zinnias. She drew the Walther and fired twice into his chest from 18 inches, followed by a third to the head as he collapsed. The total time from the stumble to the shots was exactly 4.2 seconds. Before his coffee cup even shattered on the ground, Annelies was back on her gazelle, pedaling west with a heart of ice. She dove into the Barenstraat, her speed increasing as the first panicked shouts of "Halt!" erupted behind her. Navigating the Rundstraat and the maze of the Jordan district, she utilized every narrow alleyway her father had taught her. She reached Philip Jansen's bookshop, a known safe house, by 2:07 p.m., walking the bicycle inside with a feigned air of calm. Only when the door clicked shut did the adrenaline crash, leaving her gasping for air. The retaliation was immediate. The Gestapo sealed the district, hunting for a girl with blonde braids, but in a city of 40,000 such girls, she had already vanished. Brenner's death delayed the deportations by 3 weeks, a window that allowed the resistance to evacuate 647 children to safety. That night, staring at the ceiling of her attic room, Annelies didn't feel the weight of guilt, only the cold satisfaction of a successful calculation. She realized, with a tremor of fear that had nothing to do with the Nazis, that it was getting easier to kill. The Annelies who fed ducks on the canals was being consumed by Defeatser, a weapon of pure operational focus. She fell into a fitful sleep at dawn, unaware that her efficiency had finally caught the attention of a man who didn't believe in coincidences, SS Sturmbannführer Otto Kemper, a hunter who was currently tracing the exact path of her bicycle tires back toward the heart of her world. The death of Klaus Brenner ignited a firestorm within the Gestapo that even the cold rains of a Dutch winter could not extinguish. To lead the hunt, Berlin dispatched SS Sturmbannführer Otto Kemper, a 38-year-old former detective whose mind worked like a precision-engineered watch. In his office at the Utrecht headquarters, Kemper constructed a map of Amsterdam bristling with pins, each representing a site where a high-ranking officer had fallen to a lone cyclist. He was not a man who believed in miracles, he believed in patterns. His profile of the assassin was clinical, a trained operative, likely an Amsterdam native with professional shooting discipline. He theorized Defeatser was either a male resistance fighter in a wig or a seasoned female agent. He simply could not conceive of his primary adversary being a 15-year-old girl with schoolbooks in her basket. By the winter of 1943, Kemper's response strangled the city's mobility. He instituted a mandatory bicycle registration program, decreeing that every frame must display a visible metal plate. Random searches became the norm, with guards empowered to tear apart baskets at any whim. Despite these tightening nooses, Annelies adapted with a mechanic's ingenuity. She began using multiple bicycles, swapping frames to break the visual patterns Kemper was tracing. She befriended local shopkeepers who provided safe harbor garages and developed false bottom baskets that could withstand a cursory inspection. She even expanded her hunting grounds to Haarlem, Utrecht, and The Hague, using the Dutch railway system to strike where Kemper least expected. The operations grew more daring and more grim. In October 1943, she posed as a lost student to execute a railway commandant in Haarlem, delaying deportation trains for 3 crucial weeks. By December, she performed a surgical drive-by in a crowded Christmas market, eliminating a Dutch NSB recruiter without harming a single civilian. However, the cost of this efficiency was a slow erosion of her soul. The March 1944 assassination of Helena van Dijk, a female collaborator who had betrayed 40 resistance members, haunted her. Shooting a woman at a doorstep felt different, more intimate, more like the very murder she claimed to fight. By April 1944, her tally stood at 38 confirmed kills, but her sleep was a frantic landscape of nightmares. "I don't remember what normal feels like," she whispered to Peter Vogel one night. His reply was a somber anchor, None of us do. But we're keeping others alive. Luck, however, is a finite resource. In March 1944, Kemper nearly snared her in a Vondel Park ambush, forcing Anneliese to cycle blindly into a freezing pond to escape a circle of 20 soldiers. The closest brush with death came a month later in the Rocken district. A German officer who had survived one of her previous attempts locked eyes with her as she pedaled past. Recognition sparked in his gaze. As he reached for his radio to alert the district, Anneliese pulled her Walther PPK and shot him mid-sentence. The escape was a chaotic blur of crashing through market stalls and abandoning her father's gazelle in a dark alley. She reached a safe house with her clothes soaked in sweat and her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had escaped the hunter once more, but Kemper now had something he'd never had before. A direct eyewitness description and the serial number of a bicycle registered to a shop that had been closed since 1940. She was no longer just a ghost in the machine. She was a target with a trail, and as the Gestapo began knocking on the doors of her old neighborhood, Anneliese realized that the line between the hunter and the hunted had finally vanished. In April 1944, the air in the resistance safe house felt thicker than usual, heavy with the scent of unwashed wool and the metallic tang of desperation. Commander Henrik Backer unrolled a set of surveillance maps that didn't detail supply depots or railway switches. Instead, they marked the playgrounds and school routes used by the children of high-ranking Nazi officials. The plan was a desperate gambit. Kidnap 3 children ages 4 to 9, to use as leverage for the release of captured resistance members. Because of her unmatched mobility on the Amsterdam cobblestones and her harmless appearance, Anneliese was selected to lead the snatch and grab. Initially, she listened with the numb acceptance that had become her default state. But as Backer described the abduction routes, a memory unspooled in her mind like a tangled film reel, her father's voice telling her to be invisible, but also the way he had once tucked a blanket around the youngest Goldstein child in their basement. These were children, not combatants. "I won't do it," she said, her voice cutting through the strategic murmurs of the room. Backer looked up, his jaw tight. "Orders are orders, Anneliese. We are losing people every day." "I've killed 38 people," she countered, standing her ground against the man who had taught her to shoot. "All of them chose to wear that uniform or serve the Reich. Children don't choose. The moment we target them, we become the very monsters we're fighting." The debate was fierce, pitting the moral luxury of some against the ruthless pragmatism of others. Peter Vogel stepped to her side, his silent support tipping the scales. "She's right," he said. "There has to be a line." By a narrow vote of 7 to 4, the operation was abandoned. Backer thanked her privately for reminding them of their humanity, but his warning was chilling. Some in the network now saw her as soft, a weapon that had developed a conscience. She proved them wrong in May 1944. While cycling through the Eastern District, Anneliese witnessed a scene that shattered her mechanical detachment. A Dutch SS auxiliary named Gerrit Bos was clearing an apartment block when he dragged a mother and her infant into the street. To the horror of the onlookers, Bos shot the child point blank, laughing as the mother collapsed into the gutter. Anneliese didn't check for guards. She didn't look for an escape route. She dismounted her bicycle, walked directly toward Bos, and pulled her Walther PPK in full view of a dozen witnesses. She fired 5 times, chest, abdomen, and twice to the head, with a raw, jagged rage that was the opposite of her usual surgical precision. She pedaled away as the crowd stood in a stunned, frozen silence. The execution wasn't tactical. It was a visceral confirmation that she still knew exactly where the line was. Later, shivering in a safe house, she confessed to Peter, "I was afraid I'd lost myself completely. I was afraid I was just a machine." He looked at her with a mixture of pity and respect. "You just proved you aren't. But feeling things again, that's going to make the next part much harder." Anneliese nodded, realizing that while she had saved her soul, she had also discarded the emotional armor that kept her safe. She was human again, which meant she was vulnerable, just as Otto Kemper's task force began to focus its entire weight on a single bicycle shop in the Jordan district, a shop that was supposed to be empty. By the summer of 1944, the tally of the dead had reached 47, and Otto Kemper had moved a cot into his office at the Uterpestrat. He had finally discarded his theories of foreign agents. The assassin was a local girl driven by a personal vendetta. He narrowed his suspect list to 127 young women whose families had been liquidated by the Reich since 1940. In August, he began setting honey traps. During a scouting mission in the Plantage district, drawn by false intelligence of a resistance weapons shipment, Anneliese smelled the ambush before she saw it. The soldiers were too rigid, the street too unnaturally quiet. She aborted, but Kemper's blocking forces were already closing the escape routes. She spent a frantic hour playing cat and mouse through narrow botanical passages, eventually pedaling through the artist's zoo. A 9mm round from a Luger P-08 grazed her shoulder as she vaulted a low stone wall, vanishing into the canal-side greenery. The wound was superficial, but the hunger winter, was beginning. Her body, weakened by severe rationing, succumbed to infection. For 3 days, she lay in a basement safe house, shivering through a delirium where the faces of the 47 stood at the foot of her bed. Peter Vogel stayed by her side, changing bandages and listening as she confessed every nightmare she'd kept locked away. "You're the bravest person I know," he whispered, a rare moment of tenderness in a world of steel. By September, the failed Allied airborne assault of Operation Market Garden had left the Netherlands in a state of brutal limbo. The resistance, desperate to support the stalled advance, obtained a list of 300 Dutch collaborators. Annelies, now 16 and operating on sheer willpower, was assigned 12 high-value targets. In 6 weeks of relentless violence, she used everything from her Walther PPK to poison cigarettes, bringing her total to 52. But the strain was shattering her. In November, she approached the home of District Administrator Johannes Koster only to find Kemper himself waiting in the foyer. She shot her way out, killing 2 soldiers, but her bicycle was shredded by MP-40 fire. She fled on foot through her childhood streets in the Jordan, saved only by neighbors who pointed the Gestapo in the wrong direction. She spent the night hiding in the cold, hollowed-out basement of her father's abandoned shop, the very place she had once felt safest, now a tomb of memories. The betrayal came from within. Jan Visser, a logistics coordinator, had traded the target list for his son's life. When Annelies found him, the man was a shell, sobbing that he'd done it to save his boy from the firing squad. She understood his pain, felt the crushing weight of it in her own chest, and still pulled the trigger. The famine was now in full swing. 20,000 civilians were dying of starvation, and Annelies was reduced to eating tulip bulbs to maintain the strength to hold a pistol. In December, Kemper finally made his breakthrough. Cross-referencing alibis with the timing of 52 attacks, he found one name that appeared nowhere: Annelies de Vries, daughter of a subversive, expert cyclist, 16 years old. Jan Mulder, a sympathetic clerk in the Gestapo office, risked the gallows to send a one-word warning: run. But Annelies refused to vanish. She discarded her bicycle, disguised herself as a hunched woman in rags, and continued to strike from the frozen shadows of the famine-stricken streets. She knew the end was near, not just of the war but of her own luck. As 1945 dawned, she began writing letters to Peter and hiding her diary, unaware that Kemper had just authorized a massive house-to-house sweep of the Jordan with one specific instruction: bring him the girl alive, no matter how many soldiers she had to kill to stay free. By March 18, 1945, the air was brittle with the approaching end of the Reich. When intelligence arrived regarding a massive weapons shipment at Warehouse 7 in the Rotterdam docks, Annelies felt the prickle of intuition. The details were too tidy, the timing too perfect. Despite her warnings, Commander Backer was desperate. The resistance needed steel for the final push. Annelies arrived at 7 p.m. on foot, leaving her bicycle behind to slip through the shadows of the Maas River. From an abandoned cannery, she watched the dockworkers move. Their coordination was too rigid, their posture too military. It wasn't a shipment, it was a tomb. Suddenly, searchlights cut through the gloom, and Kemper's voice boomed over a loudspeaker, chilling the damp air. Annelies de Vries. We know you're here. Surrender. You've killed your last Nazi. The trap snapped shut with 40 soldiers pouring from the crates. Annelies broke cover, zigzagging through shipping containers as bullets stitched the metal around her. Hemmed in against the freezing river, she spotted a lone bicycle leaning against a lamppost, a final gift from fate. She mounted the frame, pedaling furiously through a maze of cranes and cargo. She jumped a loading gap that forced the German vehicles into a wide detour and slammed through a wooden checkpoint barrier, guards diving for cover. A parting volley shredded her rear tire, the rim scraping the cobblestones with a rhythmic, screeching protest as she veered into the city streets. Hearing Kemper's shoot to kill order over a passing military radio, she realized they would never take her alive. She abandoned the ruined bike and slipped into the icy canals, wading through chest-high water to bypass the tracking dogs. Hypothermic and trembling, she emerged near Kemper's command post at 8:30 p.m. She approached from the blind side, her Walther PPK aimed at his back. "Kemper," she called out. He turned, his face contorting into a mask of pure shock as he stared at the soaking, shivering 16-year-old girl who had decimated his officer corps. "You," he whispered. "Your defeat, sir?" The standoff was broken only when Peter Vogel suddenly emerged from the fog, opening fire to draw the guards' attention. "Go!" Peter screamed, his voice raw with sacrifice. "Your story has to survive." Annalise watched in horror as Peter fell under a hail of gunfire, buying her the seconds she needed to hotwire a car and vanish into the night. She spent the following weeks in a remote farmhouse outside Harlem, a ghost haunting a barn. Numb and hollowed by Peter's death, she read his final letter until the ink blurred. "Stay human, Annalise. That's how we win." But as the German army collapsed in late April, she learned Kemper was preparing to flee to Germany. On April 28th, violating every order to stay hidden, she borrowed one last bicycle and rode 15 kilometers to his quarters. She found him packing, a man stripped of his right-given grandeur. "I knew it would be you," he said, almost relieved. He tried to claim they were merely soldiers on opposite sides, but Annalise didn't blink. "You chose to invade. I chose to defend. Not the same." A single, clean shot ended the hunt forever. She left the bicycle at the scene, a symbolic shedding of the weapon she no longer required, and walked the long road home. When liberation finally arrived on May 5, 1945, and the streets of Amsterdam erupted in jubilant song, Annalise watched from a silent window, a girl who had survived the war but wondered if she had left the best parts of herself behind in the blood-stained snow of the Jordan. When the 1st Canadian Army liberated Amsterdam on May 5, 1945, the city became a riot of orange flags and liberation songs. But for Annalise there was only a ringing silence. While the men of the resistance were paraded as heroes, the leadership pulled her aside. A 16-year-old girl with 52 confirmed kills was a narrative the rebuilding nation wasn't ready to handle. Her story was too brutal, her youth too haunting. They offered her a false identity, a small pension, and a choice: remain a ghost or risk being branded a monster. She chose the shadow, returning to a world of school desks and chalkboards where she sat among peers who worried about grades while she carried the weight of the men she had buried. The 1950s were a blur of hypervigilance. She worked in a quiet library, scanning rooms for exits and jumping at the sound of heavy boots. Relationships were impossible. She could never explain the scars on her shoulder or why she woke up screaming in the dark. It wasn't until 1960 that she finally returned home, reopening WWII. In the smell of chain grease and the mechanical rhythm of truing a wheel, she found her only sanctuary. She became a meticulous mechanic, a woman of few words who some veterans recognized by the 1,000-yard stare in her eyes, the silent mark of those who had looked through a sight and pulled the trigger. For decades, her history was systematically erased. The official records favored conservative, male-led narratives, ignoring the teenage girls who had done the wet work in the trenches of the Jordan. It wasn't until 1975 that Peter Vogel's niece, Clara, tracked her down. Handing over Peter's final letter, Annalise finally wept, realizing that the love she had suppressed for survival was the only thing that had truly kept her human. But the most profound healing came in 2000, when a woman named Rachel Goldberg arrived at the shop. Rachel was one of the children saved from Brenner's list. She showed Annalise photos of her grandchildren, 5 generations of life that existed only because of a girl on a bicycle. For the first time, Annalise saw that her violence hadn't just ended lives, it had birthed them. Recognition finally came in 2014, when the Netherlands awarded her the Mobilization War Cross. At 88, she attended the ceremony with a walker, telling a hushed room of journalists that she remembered every face she had ever killed. "I'd do it again," she whispered, "and I'd hate every second." Annalise de Vries passed away peacefully in her sleep on January 15, 2018. She was buried beside her father with a simple headstone engraved with a bicycle and the words, "She rode for freedom." Today, as thousands of cyclists stream past the old shop in the Jordan, most have no idea that the pavement beneath their wheels once ran red by the hand of a child. Her diary, sealed in a waterproof container and buried in the basement of the shop, remains under a strict legal embargo until the year 2068. But recently, a local contractor renovating the cellar discovered a secondary, smaller tin hidden behind a loose brick, one not mentioned in her will, containing a final, uncoded map of Amsterdam with 3 pins marked in locations that match no known resistance operations, suggesting that De Fietser may have carried one last secret to her grave that could rewrite the history of the occupation entirely. Annalise carried the faces of 52 men in her nightmares for nearly a century so that the streets of Amsterdam could be filled with children instead of soldiers. She was denied medals and ceremonies for decades because her courage made people uncomfortable. If her story moved you, don't leave her in the shadows. By hitting the subscribe button and liking this video, you are helping us pull these forgotten heroes out of the darkness. Comment below and tell us, what would you have done in her place? Let's make sure her diary isn't the only thing that survives.